Hello, everybody. Welcome to PNW. We are going to be talking about pioneers and settlers today, and most famously, the Oregon Trail. Here is a picture here of what we kind of imagine when we think about this time, and this is real pictures. We're finally at the point of history where we have photographs to actually show us what it was like. But we're talking roughly about 1840 to 1869. This is where we have the first mass wave of migration into the Pacific Northwest. Nearly 500,000 people. We're not 100% sure of how many, but we can guess that's how many because we didn't have exact records. But around 500,000 people end up migrating to Oregon and to California. We're mostly going to focus on a lot of the ones going to Oregon because that's in the Pacific Northwest, especially what's now known as the Willamette River Valley, which is where the huge majority of people in Oregon still live to this day. Western versus Eastern Oregon, much like Eastern versus Western Washington. And my question that I gave out to my students earlier today was, would you rather choose to live in California or Oregon if you had to make the trip? And that's something you can mull over. Currently, I'm recording this in California, but I can see why a lot of people would go to Oregon as well. So, speaking of reasons, why would people go west in the first place? A lot of times, they wanted to start a new life. Other times they were seeking personal adventure. A lot of times people wanted to acquire wealth and use the region's natural resources. What happened a lot of times was that there were larger families in this period of history back in the 1800s, and sometimes it would go to where the firstborn child, mostly the firstborn son, would inherit the land of their father. And a lot of times the people who were younger, such as second, third born, all the younger kids would have to decide to either maybe move to the city or a lot of them ended up moving out west and kind of starting their own farms and their own businesses. A lot of times people want to increase their political, social, or economic power and influence. They think, maybe I'm not a big deal here in my hometown in New York or in Missouri or maybe even Ohio, but, maybe I can be a big deal if I move over there. And that's happened a lot of times. This is why a lot of people moved to America in the first place, and why a lot of immigrants still come to America or move to anywhere from their country or place of origin. Then they also want to acquire and develop free or inexpensive land. A lot of times, if you came over to Oregon, if you got there, if you could settle on the land, well, hey, congratulations, it's yours. And that's pretty good incentive. And a lot of times, people were just following family members or other friends. If everyone else is moving, I should too. So who promoted actually moving to Oregon? A lot of times, it was the explorers and fur traders who were already here. They talked to other travelers about the scenic beauty, the fertile soils, and the moderate climate here in the Pacific Northwest. Some people were reading Lewis and Clark's journal. Remember, Lewis and Clark's journal was about, 30 to 40 years at this time period. So a lot of people wanted to see what the PNW was all about. And other time people would actually read newspapers and magazines. There were writers and authors who were basically paid, or at least they were just really struck with West fever, and they would just say, hey, the West is the best place to go to. Everyone needs to move there immediately. And a lot of times they hadn't even been there, but they were just kind of enamored with this idea. So what was one of the options for actually moving to the Pacific Northwest? Well, one way to go was going around the Horn, Cape Horn, that is, and that's the very bottom of South America. They didn't have the Panama Canal here. That would come in 1905, so their only way of getting there was to take a boat from an eastern city over here and going all the way around South America. Places like Philadelphia, or Philly, Boston, Baltimore, New York City. However, it was a 3-month journey and it was very expensive. You would probably usually land somewhere like in San Francisco or at the mouth of the Columbia River. However, most people could not afford this trip, so they took the overland route instead. As you can see, these people have their wagon turned over. This would take 5 to 6 months as opposed to 3 months, and it was quite a bit difficult, but it was much less expensive. lots of times people would walk or ride on the wagons, and it was quite the journey. There were things like accidents, diseases, there were even epidemics. They had to watch out for wild animals like coyotes, and they had to deal with attacks from hostile Indians as well. It was not very safe. There was no guarantee that you would make it. Alright, so did Lewis and Clark take the easiest journey when they originally came over to the Pacific Northwest? Short answer is no, they did not. They took, basically, because they were going into uncharted territory, they didn't know the easiest way of navigating. But other navigators that came in the 30 years after them had kind of figured out the best way of getting through the Rocky Mountains, which was really the most difficult part of the journey. People like Benjamin Bonneville, who the Bonneville Dam is named after, discovered places like the South Pass in the Rocky Mountains. And the South Pass was the easiest place to actually cross the mountains for the average person. So once we figured out how to cross the Rocky Mountains somewhat easily, and then hook back up with a lot of the rivers that go in the Pacific Northwest, it made it so it was much easier to go that way. Finally, there were people like Doc Newell and Joe Meek. They broke through the Blue Mountains and figured out a path through those as well. So it was all about trying to figure out how to deal with those mountains, because the mountains were definitely the hardest part to cross. So the Oregon Trail. It went from Independence, Missouri, all the way to Fort Vancouver, Washington, and then finally ended with the Willamette River Valley of Oregon. So usually you left in late spring, and you'd hope to get there about 6 months later. Independence, Missouri was the first part here. You'd go through the Great Plains, and finally you'd go through the Rocky Mountains around here between Wyoming and Idaho. And then up here, this is where you go through the Blue Mountains, and then finally meet up with the Columbia River, and then finally you were in Oregon. It was 2,170 miles overall. The first leg was crossing the Great Plains. This was the easy part. It started off easy and got harder as it went. So this was the easiest part because you had fresh water. You could go 20 miles a day, which is pretty good if you're considering those heavy loaded wagons. And this was the grassland of the Great Plains. Very easy to cross overall. The second leg, though, crossing the Rockies, this was very difficult and slow. You had to head towards that South Pass that we were talking about earlier. And then finally, when you would get through the mountain pass, you'd reach Fort Hall. This is where you had to make your big decision. I think I had it earlier here where Fort Hall is. It's right around here in Idaho. So from here, you could either decide to go north and go up to Oregon and Washington up here, or you could decide to go south and go to California. This is where you had to make your big decision, was there at Fort Hall in Idaho. The California Trail, if you decided to go through California, this is what you would have to do. You'd have to cross the Great American Desert, which goes by a few different names today, but basically it's going through the northern section of Nevada, the Great Basin. So basically it was hot and dry, and it was hard to get water, and then you'd have to come and cross the Sierra Nevada mountains. No easy task. So going to California was a little bit more difficult than going to Oregon. But if you decided to change your mind halfway through, you could actually go on the Applegate Trail if you're going towards California, and you would go to the southern part of Oregon instead. The third leg, if you decided to go to Oregon, this is the way it would go. You'd go to Whitman's mission, also known as the Wheelapatu mission. You would go around to the Snake River, just like Lewis and Clark had done. You'd cross the Blue Mountains, and then once you cross there, you would actually meet up to where the Tri-Cities are today, around Walla Walla as well, somewhere right in there, and that's where the Whitman's mission was. After the Whitman Massacre, which we talked about last time, you would bypass the Whitman mission and basically just go onto the Columbia River and float down there with all your stuff. Imagine loading up a wagon and putting it all on a raft and floating down the Columbia River. It was actually a pretty normal sight. And then here's the final part, going down the Columbia River itself. One of the biggest portions here was right here, the Celilo Falls. This doesn't exist anymore. This was actually flooded by the building of the Dalles Dam. So Celilo Falls doesn't exist like this anymore, but when it did, you couldn't just ride your raft down this waterfall. So you had to actually pick up your raft, and you'd have to pick up your entire boat and go around the falls. So that was really difficult. But once you did, you could float down to Fort Vancouver, and you'd be meted by this guy here. His name was McLaughlin, and he would usually advise people to go south down to the Willamette River Valley, because that's where the Columbia River and the Willamette rivers meet up in what's now present-day Portland, and then people would go down that. So it was a lot about following the rivers, similar to Lewis and Clark, but taking a different journey through the mountains was the important part there. You could either follow the river by foot or float down it. And of course, floating down it sounds easier, but it had its own problems as well, especially when it comes to things like hopefully the boat isn't sinking or capsizing or anything like that. It could be very dangerous. So honoring the pioneers and what they were able to do. They were tough people. They went through 2,000 miles of hardships. The reasons for going and their successes was, it's basically, it was a high risk, high reward venture. If you left, there was a lot of economic opportunity there, and you could even get free land at the end of it. So sometimes that made the struggles worth it in the end. And they also achieved greater independence. They got a brand new life at the end of all of this, and higher socioeconomic status. So fancy word for socio, mean, social, better social status, and better economic status as well. Put it together, socioeconomic status. So the pioneers, when all these overland trails were going, they were very hardy people, and we still have a lot of monuments honoring them to this day. This is the first big, massive migration into the Pacific Northwest, and we're going to be talking about the huge consequences of this next time. So thank you guys for joining me, and I'll see you then. Bye-bye.